boy. Okay.
We have to break. We have to break the big preview is for 5 minutes.
Spots on it, but all of those on, but I think that's going to be okay. So all these spots,
You want to try that and try the
so we switch
overhead all the way down?
all the way off. But just leave from this track, I think that's one switch. Yeah. Leave those on and let's try that. Okay.
Wir haben heute William Kentridge hier in Salzburg im Museum der Moderne eröffnet und ich bin ganz glücklich, dass wir hier in Salzburg sind, denn es war von Beginn an, als die Ausstellung zum ersten Mal zu sehen war, Wunsch des Künstlers, seine an der Zauberflöte orientierte Arbeit auch hier in Salzburg zu zeigen.
It's my first time in Salzburg and my knowledge of Salzburg is from Mozart, from the Mozart chocolates you used to get, from the images of Salzburg in The Sound of Music, and from the novels of Thomas Bernhard. So from kind of the ridiculous to the, I suppose they're all a series of cliches about Salzburg is what my knowledge is.
Heute, in diesem Jahr, ist es natürlich ein besonderer Glücksfall, denn es gibt dieses Jahr das Mozartjahr und die Arbeit von William Kentridge, der sich mit der Zauberflöte auseinandergesetzt hat, mit der Aufklärung, der Zeit der Aufklärung und was daraus entstehen kann, im Positiven wie im Negativen, ist prädestiniert, um es hier in Salzburg anlässlich der Festspiele zu zeigen.
I think there are 13 or 14 fragments from Mozart's Magic Flute in the music of Black Box. Transformed, slowed down, the key is changed, the pitch is changed, the orchestration is changed, but there are, throughout the piece, I think in almost every piece of music in Black Box, there's a source somewhere in the Magic Flute.
Site in Salzburg has turned out to be quite interesting. We were approached by the director of the Salzburg Museum when we were doing the show in Berlin, and it was really the idea of perhaps doing an exhibition that would link to this idea of le grand spectacle and art and stage.
Well, this particular piece has as its theme, as its content, looking at the Herero-German War and the genocide of the Hereros in 1904 to 1907, but it's also looking at Mozart's Zauberflöte, looking at the character of Sarastro in particular, and looking at the relationship between knowledge and violence, and what happens to that knowledge if it has to be imported through the use of force. And that's both something that's there at the bottom of the Magic Flute, but it's there very present in all colonial histories.
Vielleicht werden Sie sich fragen, warum die Deutsche Bank eine solche Arbeit unterstützt, warum sie einen solchen Künstler auswählt. Es war von uns von Beginn an ein besonderes Interesse an diesem Künstler, der aus Südafrika kommt, der in Johannesburg lebt, einer schwierigen Großstadt mit reichlich Spannungen und mit vielen politischen Auseinandersetzungen. Und Kentridge hat in seiner Arbeit eine Struktur entwickelt, wie er gesellschaftliche Strukturen, wie er gesellschaftliche Hierarchien untersucht, analysiert, die uns wiederum einen ganz genauen Ausblick auch auf zukünftige Entwicklungen geben, sei es gesellschaftliche, politische, aber auch wirtschaftliche Entwicklungen. Und wir sind alle fasziniert von dem ganz speziellen Stück, das William Kentridge damals für das Deutsche Guggenheim, unsere Ausstellungshalle in Berlin, entwickelt hat, nämlich, dass er es geschafft hat, mit den Momenten der Erinnerung und der Geschichte ein Bild zu zeigen, das historische Vorkommnisse ohne erhobenen Zeigefinger zur Diskussion stellt.
It's been about 3 years now since we first started to develop the initial ideas for Black Box Chambre Noire. Of course, at that time, we had no idea that it would become such a complex and multifaceted project. We started talking very broadly about what might be possible, about what William Kentridge might be interested in, and at that time we had discussed the possibility of focusing perhaps on the history of German animation, early animation, because of course animation is a major element of Kentridge's work, and he's so strong in terms of his kinetic objects and the way that movements operate in animation.
The inspiration for Black Box, or the idea for it, came from working on another piece of theatre, a full-scale opera production of the Zauberflöte. And while working on the Magic Flute, I was working with a model of the set for the Opera House in Brussels. And while working on the set, I discovered there was a pleasure in the small scale and wanted to continue exploring that miniaturized scale. So when I started working on the idea of looking at German colonial history, I decided to keep as one of the elements the small scale of a miniature theatre. The project took about a year, but it took about 8 months of very intense work. So there were some months of preliminary thinking and sketches and testing, and then 8 months where there was full attention just on the project.
During this period we had some back and forth discussions, but he was also very busy working on a production of Mozart's The Magic Flute. And so that turned out to be quite an interesting element that he would also develop in the course of thinking through the Deutsche Gewinnheim-Commission.
Bei alt und jung im ganzen Land. Weiß mit dem
William Kentridge haben wir zuerst in Stockholm kennengelernt. Es wird Sie vielleicht überraschen, aber in Stockholm wurden alle Details für das Theater gefertigt. Und es war unglaublich, zum ersten Mal nach Schweden zu kommen und dort in eine Unterseekammer, in der früher Tornados gefertigt wurden, dieses Marionettentheaterprogramm und dieses Bühnenbauprogramm vorzufinden. Und wir sind uns nach Stockholm immer wieder begegnet. Er kam dann mit der Ausstellung nach Berlin und dort entstand die Idee bei der Ausstellungseröffnung, warum gehen wir nicht mit dieser Ausstellung in seine Heimatstadt Johannesburg.
The mechanical objects were designed and tested in Johannesburg but made in Stockholm. And the computer programming we did in Stockholm, and music was done in Namibia and in Johannesburg, and the project was coordinated from New York and exhibited in Berlin. So it was a lot of airlines made a lot of money from the project.
The most striking thing about William is how generous he is. He's generous just as a person and in spirit, but he's also so generous in terms of his knowledge and his points of reference and really sharing and working back and forth. And so for me as a curator, it was an incredible process to work on a new piece, to not be curating something after the fact, but to be talking back and forth about ideas, to be talking about art and history and animation. But one of the really special things was to be able to talk about this at William's home in Johannesburg, which is also where his studio is. Because you'll see so many of the elements in his work, these kind of lines and layers and animals and creatures and just all this dynamic life kind of going on happens in a microcosm in his studio. And I remember he had these wonderful cats that were hunting cats, and so we would turn around and we'd be talking in the studio and he'd be showing me work, and we'd turn around and suddenly the cat would deposit a huge bird at our feet. And one day we were on our way to his house, and there were some men that were working on a house adjacent to him, and had accidentally knocked down these telephone wires, and so he had lines spread out all throughout his home. So you just see this kind of energy and this dynamism and these specific kind of elements that are incorporated in his work. So his work and his life are not separate. They're all very interconnected and very dynamic. So that was very special.
Papageno, papageno, papageno.
This massacre, for example, happened 100 years ago, but the impact of it is still being felt. And the colonialism ended maybe 50 years ago in most of Africa, but the traces of it are still very present in Africa. And so I'm always interested in the residue of history, in both our memory or our forgetting of history, but also the strange ways in which it still stays in the soil.
And so this exhibition really reflects the process that he went through, and also a historical sort of journey. So you have things like an initial rendering of the curtain and the stage and the idea of the theatrical behind the black box. Then you have sort of more of a geographical kind of representation of the piece. You also have various historical texts. Kentridge works a lot with different found paper, with everything from a map of Johannesburg to this, which is it's actually a menu for a shooting party. It's for when you go out and hunt, and it's a specific kind of dinner that you can have. It's a text from the early 1900s, and obviously it's a very strong when you think about this work, and he has his own layers of sort of meaning and movement throughout them. So that happens. Of course, there are also the charcoal drawings, which he constantly reworks in order to create his animations. And they have a very interesting kind of layer, and there's a lot of pentimenti. You can see where he erases and reworks them, because rather than in traditional animation where each drawing is different, you have cell-by-cell animation. With Kentridge, he takes a sheet and reworks it, and draws with charcoal, erases, redraws again. So you have the whole history of a kind of movement and an idea within one sheet of paper, really. So a lot of what you'll see here reflects that, and all of what you'll see here is actually incorporated into the film itself, the black box. So it's both taking you on a journey in terms of the drawings, but also making you think a bit about the process of creation, the different layers of history and the different layers of meaning that operate in.
So it's both about a theatre, a black box as a kind of theatre, a black box also as the inside of a camera, of a photographic camera, the space between the lens and the eyepiece. So the inside of the theatre also becomes that space. And so the piece uses projections. The Magic Flute is very much about darkness and light. And so this piece, through the use of darkness and light and projection, also reflects on that theme. And lastly, a black box, which we know from aeroplanes, is a recorder of a disaster. Whenever there's an air disaster, there's a record in the black box. So black box is also something that records a disaster. And so in that sense also, this is, as it were, a metaphor for that record of a disaster.